road, the tinkle of the piano and the voice of the youth with the drugged eyes singing, "And you'll wear a simple gingham gown." From the yard below, the cluck-cluck of the chickens and the cooing of pigeons. His first thought was of his sister and of her children, and of what this bomb, hurled from the clouds, would mean to her. He thought of Cutler at the height of his power and usefulness, by this one disreputable act dragged into the mire of what disaster it might bring to the party, to himself. If, as the woman invited, he helped to hush it up, and Tammany learned the truth, it would make short work of him. It would say for the murderer of Bamp he had one law, and for the rich brother-in-law who had tried to kill the girl he deceived another. But before he gave voice to his thoughts he recognized them as springing only from panic. They were of a part with the acts of men driven by sudden fear, and of which acts in their sane moments they would be incapable. The shock of the woman's words had unsettled his traditions. Not only was he condemning a man unheard, but a man who, though he might dislike him, he had for years, for his private virtues, trusted and admired. The panic passed, and with a confident smile he shook his head. "I don't believe you," he said quietly. The manner of the woman was equally calm, equally assured. "Will you see her?" she asked. "I'd rather see my brother-in-law," he answered. The woman handed him a card. "Dr. Muir took him to his private hospital," she said. "I loaned them my car because it's a limousine. The address is on that card. But," she added, "both your brother and Sammy, that's Sam Muir, the doctor, asked you wouldn't use the telephone. They're afraid of a leak." Apparently Wharton did not hear her. As though it were Exhibit A, presented in evidence by the defense, he was studying the card she had given him. He stuck it in his pocket. "I'll go to him at once," he said. To restrain or dissuade him, the woman made no sudden move. In level tones she said, "Your brother-in-law asked especially that you wouldn't do that until you'd fixed it with the girl. Your face is too well known. He's afraid someone might find out where he is, and for a day or two no one must know that." "This doctor knows it," retorted Wharton. The suggestion seemed to strike Mrs. Earle as humorous. For the first time she laughed. "Oh, Sammy!" she exclaimed. "He's a lobbygow of mine. He's worked for me for years. I could send him up the river if I liked. He knows it." Her tone was convincing. "They both asked," she continued evenly, "you should keep off until the girl is out of the country and fixed." Wharton frowned thoughtfully. And observing this, the eyes of the woman showed that so far toward the unfortunate incident the attitude of the district attorney was to her most gratifying. Wharton ceased frowning. "How fixed?" he asked. Mrs. Earle shrugged her shoulders. "Cutler's idea is money," she said, "but believe me, he's wrong. This girl is a vampire. She'll only come back to you for more. She'll keep on threatening to tell the wife, to tell the papers. The way to fix her is to throw a scare into her, and there's only one man can do that. There's only one man that can hush this thing up. That's you." "When can I see her?" asked Wharton. "Now," said the woman. "I'll bring her." Wharton could not suppress an involuntary start. "Here?" he exclaimed. For the shade of a second Mrs. Earle exhibited the slightest evidence of embarrassment. "My room's in a mess," she explained, "and she's not hurt so much as Sammy said. He told her she was in bad, just to keep her quiet until you got here." Mrs. Earle opened one of the doors leading from the room. "I won't be a minute," she said. Quietly she closed the door behind her. Upon her disappearance the manner of the district attorney underwent an abrupt change. He ran softly to the door opposite the one through which Mrs. Earle had passed and pulled it open. But if beyond he expected to find an audience of eavesdroppers, he was disappointed. The room was empty and bore no evidence of recent occupation. He closed the door and, from the roller-top desk, snatching a piece of paper, scribbled upon it hastily. Wrapping the paper around a coin and holding it exposed to view, he showed himself at the window. Below him, to an increasing circle of hens and pigeons, Nolan was still scattering crumbs. Without withdrawing his gaze from them, the chauffeur nodded. Wharton opened his hand, and the note fell into the yard. Behind him he heard the murmur of voices, the sobs of a woman in pain, and the rattle of a doorknob. As from the window he turned quickly, he saw that toward the spot where his note had fallen, Nolan was tossing the last remnants of his sandwich. The girl who entered with Mrs. Earle, leaning on her and supported by her, was tall and fair. Around her shoulders her blonde hair hung in disorder, and around her waist, under the kimono Mrs. Earle had thrown about her, were wrapped many layers of bandages. The girl moved unsteadily and sank into a chair. In a hostile tone Mrs. Earle addressed her. "Rose," she said, "this is the district attorney." To him she added, "She calls herself Rose Gerard." One hand the girl held close against her side, with the other she brushed back the hair from her forehead. From half-closed eyes she stared at Wharton defiantly. "Well," she challenged, "what about it?" Wharton seated himself in front of the roller-top desk. "Are you strong enough to tell me?" he asked. His tone was kind, and this the girl seemed to resent. "Don't you worry," she sneered. "I'm strong enough to tell all I know, to you and to the papers and to a jury, until I get justice." She clenched her free hand and feebly shook it at him. "That's what I'm going to get," she cried, her voice breaking hysterically. "Justice." From behind the armchair in which the girl half reclined, Mrs. Earle caught the eye of the district attorney and shrugged her shoulders. "Just what did happen?" asked Wharton. Apparently with an effort, the girl pulled herself together. "I first met your brother-in-law," she began. Wharton interrupted quietly. "Wait," he said. "You are not talking to me as anybody's brother-in-law, but as the district attorney." The girl laughed vindictively. "I don't wonder you're ashamed of him," she jeered. Again she began. "I first met Ham Cutler last May. He wanted to marry me then. He told me he was not a married man." As her story unfolded, Wharton did not again interrupt, and, speaking quickly in abrupt, broken phrases, the girl brought her narrative to the moment when, as she claimed, Cutler had attempted to kill her. At this point a knock at the locked door caused both the girl and her audience to start. Wharton looked at Mrs. Earle inquiringly, but she shook her head, and with a look at him also of inquiry and of suspicion as well, opened the door. With apologies, her head waiter presented a letter. "For Mr. Wharton," he explained, "from his chauffeur." Wharton's annoyance at the interruption was most apparent. "What the devil?" he began. He read the note rapidly, and with a frown of irritation raised his eyes to Mrs. Earle. "He wants to go to New Rochelle for an inner tube," he said. "How long would it take him to get there and back?" The hard and distrustful expression upon the face of Mrs. Earle, which was habitual, was now most strongly in evidence. Her eyes searched those of Wharton. "20 minutes," she said. "He can't go," snapped Wharton. "Tell him," he directed the waiter, "to stay where he is. Tell him I may want to go back to the office any minute." He turned eagerly to the girl. "I'm sorry," he said. With impatience he crumpled the note into a ball and glanced about him. At his feet was a waste-paper basket. Fixed upon him he saw, while pretending not to see, the eyes of Mrs. Earle burning with suspicion. If he destroyed the note, he knew suspicion would become certainty. Without an instant of hesitation, carelessly he tossed it intact into the waste-paper basket. Toward Rose Gerard he swung the revolving chair. "Go on, please," he commanded. The girl had now reached the climax of her story, but the eyes of Mrs. Earle betrayed the fact that her thoughts were elsewhere. With an intense and hungry longing, they were concentrated upon her own waste-paper basket. The voice of the girl in anger and defiance recalled Mrs. Earle to the business of the moment. "He tried to kill me," shouted Miss Rose, "and his shooting himself in the shoulder was a bluff. That's my story. That's the story I'm going to tell the judge." Her voice soared shrilly. "That's the story that's going to send your brother-in-law to Sing Sing." For the first time Mrs. Earle contributed to the general conversation. "You talk like a fish," she said. The girl turned upon her savagely. "If he don't like the way I talk," she cried, "he can come across." Mrs. Earle exclaimed in horror. Virtuously her hands were raised in protest. "Like hell he will," she said. "You can't pull that under my roof." Wharton looked disturbed. "Come across?" he asked. "Come across," mimicked the girl. "Send me abroad and keep me there, and I'll swear it was an accident. 25,000, that's all I want. Cutler told me he was going to make you governor. He can't make you governor if he's in Sing Sing, can he? Ain't it worth 25,000 to you to be governor? Come on," she jeered. "Kick in." With a grave but untroubled voice, Wharton addressed Mrs. Earle. May I use your telephone?" he asked. He did not wait for her consent.